Green and Coad returning from a reconnaissance just east of Chongju, 29 October 1950. The Battle of Chongju took place during the United Nations offensive towards the Yalu River, which followed the North Korean invasion of South Korea at the start of the Korean War. The battle was fought between Australian forces from 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment and the 17th Tank Brigade of the Korean People's Army for control of Chongju, North Korea and the surrounding area. After detecting a strong North Korean armoured force equipped with T-34 tanks and Su-76 self-propelled guns on a thickly wooded ridgeline astride the line of advance, the Australians launched a series of company attacks with American M4 Sherman tanks and aircraft in support. Despite heavy resistance, the North Koreans were forced to withdraw, and the Australians captured their objectives after 3 hours of fighting. That evening the North Koreans were strongly reinforced, attacking the Australian southern flank manned by D Company 3 RA, and partially penetrating their perimeter. After 2 hours of fighting the assault was repulsed, and the North Koreans subsequently launched a furious assault against A Company 3 RA on the northern position, which also failed amid heavy losses. The following day the Australians advanced to the high ground overlooking Chongju, killing and capturing a number of North Koreans in skirmishes. That afternoon the town itself was cleared by the remaining elements of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade without opposition. North Korean casualties during the fighting were heavy, while Australian losses included their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, who was wounded in the stomach by artillery fire after the battle and died 2 days later. The Korean War began early in the morning of 25 June 1950, following the surprise invasion of the Republic of Korea by its northern neighbor, the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Numerically superior and better equipped, the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel and rapidly advanced south, easily overcoming the South Koreans. In response, the United Nations decided to intervene on behalf of South Korea, inviting member states to send forces to restore the situation. As a consequence, American ground forces were hastily deployed in an attempt to prevent the South Koreans from collapsing. However, they too were understrength and poorly equipped, and by early August, had been forced back by the North Koreans to an enclave around Pusan, known as the Pusan Perimeter. Key US allies Britain, Canada and Australia also committed forces, although these were initially limited to naval contingents, and were largely viewed as token efforts in the US. Under diplomatic pressure the British agreed to deploy an infantry brigade in July, and would later dispatch a 2nd Brigade as the crisis worsened. The Canadians also agreed to provide an infantry brigade, although the 1st Battalion would not arrive until December 1950. A total of 21 UN member states eventually contributed forces. Australia was one of the first nations to commit units to the fighting, playing a small but sometimes significant part in the United Nations Command, which was initially led by General Douglas MacArthur. Forces deployed in Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force formed the basis of the Australian response, with P-51 Mustang fighter bombers from No. 77 Squadron RAF flying their first missions onto July, while the frigate HMAS Shoalhaven and the destroyer HMAS Battalion were also committed to naval operations. During this time the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, which had been preparing to return to Australia prior to the outbreak of the war, remained in Japan. However, on 26 July the Australian government announced that it would also commit the understrength and poorly equipped infantry battalion to the fighting, following a period of preparation. Training and re-equipment began immediately, while hundreds of reinforcements were hastily recruited in Australia as part of K-Force. They soon began arriving to fill out the battalion. The battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Floyd Walsh, was subsequently replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, an officer with extensive operational experience fighting the Japanese in New Guinea during the Second World War. Green took over from Walsh due to the latter's perceived inexperience.